Good evening, good afternoon. For those of you in other parts of the world, good morning or good night, whatever time zone you're in. And welcome to this next ASHA webinar on various issues of food and agriculture. This one is on uncultivated foods. It's an issue that is rarely discussed in the public domain, but is something that is tremendously important for hundreds of millions of people around the world. We have a very exciting panel of three speakers, whom I'll introduce very briefly in a while, and they will be speaking to us, and then there'll also be an open discussion forum. We will also have very brief translations in Hindi. बहुत संक्षिप्त में इंग्लिश में जो चर्चा हो रही है उसका अनुवाद भी इश्तियाक अहमद हमारे साथ हैं वो करेंगे. And then during the open discussion session, we will request you to put your questions in the chat box. Please address the questions to me and not in the general chat box, which I think would be disabled for you. So those questions I will look at and address them to the respective speakers. Let me just start with a very brief introduction to the topic. I'm not going to do this in any detail because the three speakers are experts on this and not me. I remember back in the late 1970s and early 80s, when as a young environmental activist, we just started Kalpuriksh, and in high school and college, we went on treks in the Tehri Garhwal area, especially to learn from the Chipko movement. And one of my fondest memories from those days in the villages is eating wild vegetables, ferns and mushrooms and various other such things. And it was for the first time, having grown up in Delhi in a highly cultivated environment, so to speak, it was amongst the first times that I was actually tasting foods from the wild. Since then, on many trips, I have been lucky enough to be fed foods from the wild, and in the early 2000s, the importance of these actually really came to me when the women of the Dalit women farmers of Deccan Development Society in Telangana, working with them, how they felt it was important, how they were actually even thinking that weeds are not weeds, but actually are important plants for food, for medicinal purposes, and so on. Early 2000s, when we worked on the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan and started looking at the kind of studies that were available on the use of uncultivated plants, we came across the astounding figure that something like 80,000 edible plant species have been used around the world through history. And of this, only about 150 or so, they will, I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong, only about 150 or so have been in regular cultivation. By far the vast majority of plant species, and of course also animal species that we have used as food, are from the wild, they're not cultivated. And of course, even today, many populations, many peoples, many communities still depend on wild foods. Of course, our entire coastal population who depend on fish, many of the fishing communities in our lakes and rivers, but also those who are living in forests or on grasslands or other areas are regularly collecting, hunting, or in some way or the other procuring wild plant and animal species for food and for other purposes. So this is clearly a very important sector. It's actually very important also, not just because this happens on a regular basis, but especially in times of crisis, like when there's a drought, or right now, I would imagine that in COVID times when livelihoods are in serious threat and food exchanges have also been affected, dependence on the availability of a diversity of wild foods must have become even more important. And this is something that happens frequently in times of crisis. Despite all of this, largely uncultivated foods or wild foods have been ignored, especially in policy circles. You don't see virtually any policy decisions on the importance of wild foods and the importance of access to wild foods. They've even been largely ignored by civil society. For instance, the Right to Food movement has not really done very much to look at the issue of access to the right to wild foods and uncultivated foods. So it's something that communities have brought up, some civil society movements have brought up, but it's largely a neglected area of work. There's multiple dimensions, and I'm sure our speakers will get into this, but it's not just an issue of having the wild food available, but that itself has serious economic and political dimensions. Who takes decisions with regard to the ecosystems from where wild or uncultivated foods come? Are they in the governance control of the communities who depend on them, or in the control of the government, or now increasingly in the control of private corporations? How are those foods obtained? Are all the traditions which used to be associated with these foods still intact, or are they eroding? Are the cultures of celebration of foods that used to exist, are they still around? Are they eroding? Are there new ways in which communities are dealing with or relating to wild foods? These are all very complex and very, very interesting and very important topics, which I'm sure the speakers will get into. So with that, I'm going to introduce our three speakers very quickly and then request them to address us. I'm not sure of the order, but the way I'm going to put it, I think if that's okay with you. So Salome Yesudas, who's a freelance researcher. She's a nutrition specialist. She's worked for many years with the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, the Krishi Vigyana Kendras, across many different parts of the country, especially including with the Dalit women farmers I mentioned earlier of the Deccan Development Society, one of the few Krishi Vigyan Kendras that's actually run with farmers themselves, and also in the National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj. We then have Debal Deb, the one with the beard, who is an ecologist, farmer, and author. He's a very sort of all-rounded person, so it's kind of hard to describe him in any one or two words. He's an author, he's a specialist in genetics, but also in the intersection between genetics, biology, culture, livelihoods, economy, and so on. He manages India's largest non-governmental rice gene bank called Vrihi, more than 1,000 varieties, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the few things that's known about him, which is rather surprising, is that he's authored many things, but authored a book, a really fat tome called Developmentality, which I had the good fortune of reviewing, and which is one of the best treatises on the myths and the assumptions and the history relating to the approach to development that we've had and alternatives to it. Our third speaker is Debjit. Debjit is with the civil society organization Living Farm, started I think in the early 1990s, based in Odisha, has worked ever since then with the Kond Adivasis of Odisha. And in doing that, he has also intersected between various different realms, the conservation of biological diversity, both in the forests and in the fields, the economics of that, the policy issues, political and policy issues relating to it, the intersection with livelihoods, and also with education, and then especially also looking at the climate crisis and the resilience of traditional agriculture relating to climate crisis. So we have these three wonderful speakers. Just quickly, some logistics before we get to them. Each of these speakers is going to be given about 15 minutes, and speakers, please be aware that at about 13 or so, I will give you a warning and will cut you off at 15 because we want lots of time for discussion. Ishtiaq, as I mentioned, will be helping us with very quick, brief translations after every speaker finishes into Hindi. If any of you has the possibility of sharing this recording on your Facebook, YouTube channels, please do. As I said earlier, you can address your questions to the speakers, but put them in my name in the chat box so that I am tracking them. We will have a set of responses to the questions, but we'll also have a final round of very brief, 1 minute each to the three speakers, just if they have any final words to say. And then our organizers will end this session. All right, so if that's clear, can I request Salome to please make your presentation? Salome, your video is off.
Yeah. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but your video is off. If you could turn on your video.
Yeah.
Yes, that's good. Please go ahead.
And I'm sharing my screen. Okay, can you see, please?
No,
Yes,
you're
except I'm seeing myself, so no, that's
not,
not.
you're not sharing the presentation. Go to the presentation, please.
Yes, that was good. We could see it, but you've turned it off again.
Salami, no, you turned off the screen sharing just as the presentation got thrown up.
Sorry.
Salami?
Yeah, now?
No, we can see only ourselves. What I can do is share the presentation at my end. If you close the, just stop sharing the screen. You instruct me.
Okay.
Shall we do it that way?
Yeah.
Ashish, with your permission, I am going to share the screen.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Just 1 second. Are you able to see?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. With the introduction of from Ashish, we all by now understood that world's food basket is shrinking at an alarming rate. And as we can see the statistics from any website which is related to food and nutrition or health, definitely they speak about and they talk about the numbers enormously, that every day, maybe every minute and every second, the food basket is shrinking. And with this backdrop and with this scenario, uncultivated food is very, very, very important. Next, please. Next.
Yeah, I am trying. Just hold on.
So what is uncultivated food? There are so many definitions, but right now what we are taking is food produced in nature without any human effort. That is right from the production process to the harvesting or from the consumption. And these uncultivated foods are not confined only to the plant kingdom. They are also the animals, birds, and from wastelands, water bodies, all the sources which are available on the earth. Like in especially when forest is a, we call it forest. We are thinking about as a commercial entry and a source of commerce. But actually, forest is a source of food. In same way, in the fields also, we always think about, when we think about the farms, we always think about the crops with human effort. But without any our intervention, there are so many plants that crop up. The moment the first rain comes, immediately the small seeds come up, and we unfortunately name them as weeds or unwanted plants. But they are very, very important, both for food, fodder, ecology, and everything. We'll see later how these unwanted or unwanted plants are very, very important, and actually most wanted plants nowadays. And the same thing applies to water bodies also. Next, please. Yeah. Uncultivated foods. I am associated with uncultivated foods since 1995. So it became a passion to me to work with. Anywhere I go, my eyes will search for uncultivated greens or uncultivated fruits, because the first thing that comes to our mind is they are safe. Safe because no chemical intervention in the production, and mostly they are naturally produced, and they are available around the year. And diversity is immense. Hundreds and thousands of foods are available as uncultivated foods, and mostly they are accessible to marginalized communities. Especially when we talk with the villagers, they say, the communities from rural areas, they say everybody asks for ration card or some identity card to get the PDS or anything, but my field or my river or my small pond never ask any identity. That's a beautiful expression, the access, when we think about accessibility, and free or no cost at all, and more equitable access. Even a small child can go and pick up an edible fruit if he likes. An old man can walk as slowly and pick up some mushrooms. So that's the beauty of these uncultivated foods. And diverse kinds of foods, very large diversity, variety. Within one species also there are a number of varieties available. And they are packed with micronutrients, and some are with proteins too. Because why I'm stressing on micronutrients, later we see, but micronutrients are most essential, as calories and protein we are somewhat okay. Then they are free from adulteration, because minimum or no human intervention. That is why they are free from adulteration also. So when consumed without any much processing, actually processing is also not required, either drying or a little salt and something was added, or just fresh also we can eat. And link it with the traditional and local knowledge. As we can see, there is one flower called gunugu, which is associated with many festivals in Telangana region. Without that flower, they don't do certain festivals which are related to agriculture. So there is so much local knowledge and traditions associated and around these uncultivated foods. And they are very resistant and tolerant, and they are, we can say that with one rain, they come up, they sprout. And small income at intervals also. One small study we did in Kurnool district with some farmers. They said within from mid-June to June, July, August, September, by selling 3 varieties, Koyukura, Chirraku and Pedabailaku, these 3 varieties, they fetch at least 1,000 rupees per month without any effort. And then these are socially, culturally, traditionally, they are also linked to our food systems. Please, next please. And I would like to share a little about my own experience with this research experience, because evidence-based experience also needs scientific validation. Whenever we speak about uncultivated foods, nobody is bothered about the amount of pesticide that is sprayed on palak, methi, or any other food. But when we say uncultivated greens, immediately say, did you do the toxicology studies? What about the photophenols in that? This and that they will question. So to get into mainstream and to give a good answer to the scientific community, what we have done is we have analyzed these uncultivated greens at the National Institute of Hyderabad, which is the premier institute for the nutrition, and we analyzed their food composition. I'll share. And then documentation of uncultivated foods was done from not only from plain lands, coastal areas, hilly and mountain regions, right from Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, and then Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Tamil Nadu, deep south in Tamil Nadu, AP and Karnataka, and all these states. I had a privilege and to do this documentation of uncultivated foods with different people, not only with the tribes, but Dalits, and also with the other communities, even the other communities also. And then there are, every part is useful, like flowers, leaf, fruit, root, tuber, bushmeat. Mostly these dominate the uncultivated food list. Hundreds comes up, but mostly these are the more frequently used parts. And usually, if you see the seasonality, summer is the usually peak time for from forest areas, and rainy season is for the farmlands and neighborhoods, which these uncultivated foods crop up. Next, please. So, out of my own interest, I made a calendar, uncultivated greens availability calendar from rain-fed farms. These are from rain-fed farms. So, when maybe people may be thinking water is needed or irrigation is necessary. No, these are just rain-fed. So from the rain-fed, we can see that from June to May, the peak is, as I was telling, July, August, September, October, till January, we will have number of plants I am talking about. Around 48 to 42 varieties of greens are available. So least is in June and May. Before the rain starts, or just they sprout. That is why in June very little. Even then, 32 varieties. Every day you can eat one kind of leafy vegetable. So that's the diversity. Next, please. And there are certain flowers which are nutritious and medicinal. For example, you can see this yellow flower. This is very common and very auspicious. And actually, this is the flower of Telangana state. And this contains highest amount of vitamin C. Around 859 milligrams of vitamin C per 100 grams of flower. So if you just mulch a handful of flower, your vitamin C is taken care of. And I have documented not only the uncultivated foods, but also the recipes, uncultivated food recipes also I have documented from many states. And actually, we say the scientific community say despise weeds, but these weeds perform fivefold functions. One is food for the humans, and second is fodder. Third is medicinal value. They have a medicinal value. Fourth, they can be plowed back or they can be composted to enhance the fertility. And fifth is there are certain varieties of these uncultivated plants which can have very strong fiber, and people try twin them to make baskets or to make threads to tie the livestock or something, and to make hanging baskets like that. So fiber, fuel wood, and also the dried up weeds can be used as fuel wood. So there are so many advantages and functions by these uncultivated foods from the farmlands especially. There are certain uncultivated foods which fetch high price. As in my first introduction I said, some uncultivated foods are very, very fetch high price because of their taste. For example, from Orissa, Shravan Chattu, that comes only in the Shravan Mas, and that costs around 500 to 6,000 rupees per kg. So they're delicious and they delicately collect these, and they will get good amount of money also. Next, please. And as you can see, I have arranged the descending order. All the uncultivated foods have higher values. And as we come to the methikura, methi, palak, and gongura, totkura, these things, when compared to the uncultivated foods, have lesser values. And this is based on my research analysis of food and food composition from National Institute of Nutrition, and the non-uncultivated foods are from the same NIN publication. So this is the most authenticated information from NIN. Next, please. And just I wanted to attract children. That's why I have chosen the fruit diversity, because it's very unfortunate when we ask children for name fruits, they end up with apple, lychee, or bear, or something peach, which nobody tasted nor saw. But there are hundreds of uncultivated fruits are available. Kusum fruit, semachinta, vepandu, and attipandu, then pulset pandu, ఈతకాయలు, రేగిపళ్ళు. These are all. Next, please. And interestingly, we have done an analysis of vitamin C and beta carotene analysis from these uncultivated greens from the farmlands of black soil and red soil. And as you can see, this is the beta carotene. Why we have chosen is beta carotene and vitamin C are very, very essential, because beta carotene is a precursor of vitamin A, and it has a lot of important functions, especially in the eyesight. And the vitamin C is one of the most talked about nowadays, because it is the base for building our immunity. So these two, long back, I think it is about 20 years back, we have analyzed. So beta carotene here, you can see that red soil species, red soil plants have little higher values than black soil plants, uncultivated greens. This is a good news, because poor people own mostly rain-fed and red soil plants, so they have good nourishment. Next, please. This is also from same vitamin C in red and black soils, and this is also, we can see red soil. There we found that slightly higher values and than black soils. But if you can see, compare with beta carotene, vitamin C is more. In vitamin C, there are some black soil also has more vitamin C in some species. But interestingly, here also the red soils belong to the poor people, so it is good information, and it is an very good information for nutritionists to incorporate these uncultivated foods into their food systems. Next, please. And fiber. Because why I have selected fiber, leaving all the nutrients, is every street has a dental care clinic. Why? Because our children and ourselves, we have no time to munch, grind, or chew, or cut with our teeth, but we have plenty of money and time to spend at dental clinics nowadays. That is because we don't want any fiber in our food. We don't want to cut, crush, or anything like that. But these uncultivated foods are rich in fiber. The fiber has a very good excellent function, and it contributes to the absorption of carbohydrates and fats and increases the satiety value, delays. That is why it delays. That's why we have more satiety value, and we will eat less, and then delays the intestinal transit of the food consumed. That's why the fiber is very, very essential, and is very important to clean our bowel, because it plays an important role in proper bowel movement and reduce chronic constipation. And also they say that it is also has an important role, functional role, in controlling colon cancer, etc., and also certain chronic diseases also. So fiber is a missing factor nowadays. Nobody eats fruit, everybody wants juice, nobody mulches, or no time, so it's simply chewing, swallowing is the only method. That's why we need uncultivated foods in our plates. Next,
so Dume, you'll have to finish in a minute or so.
Yes, next. And then why and how we should protect. We need to protect, recognize protect all sources of food, minimize forest diversion plans, and also food composition analysis of all available uncultivated foods we have to do, and publish it in the National Institute of Nutrition nutritive value books. Then we have generally, we also talk about 3 C's: consumption, conservation, and commercialization. But we have to be very, very careful when you talk about commercialization, and we should never think of commercialization of uncultivated foods. That's my personal opinion. We can debate. Next, please. Next, please. And this is very, very important. We need to prepare a dietary diversity registers, including cultivated foods for each panchayat. That becomes a document, official document of that village, and it will give enormous idea of what, how much big their food basket is. And also, the agriculture and other courses should include uncultivated foods, at least one chapter in their curriculum. Next, please. And if I know many of you have sent so many questions, and some of these books, some of these sites will answer your questions. And there is one interesting book called Nourishing Traditions Local Greens book, which is not on the website or on online, but I can send you an e-copy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salome. Sorry to have to interrupt you, but thanks. That was quite a good summary and sort of assessment of and information about the range of issues
and the significant, I mean, the tremendous importance of wild foods. There's a lot of questions, but we will come to them once we've finished with our other two panelists also. So Devjit and Deval, which one of you wants to go first?
It will be Debalda. You can unmute yourself.
Is it shared? Can you see this?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Ashish ji and Kavita, and greetings to all the wise people in the audience. This is a very important topic. This wild food, uncultivated food from the wild. Salome has been kind enough to have covered a very significant portion of wild food from the cultivated lands, farmlands. So I will now talk about the other portion, that is the forest mainly. And this is a very important source of food security of the poor. Although it remains the fact that humans, throughout its history, evolutionary history over the past 400,000 years, since the day that it evolved on Earth, Homo sapiens sapiens, have always depended on this wild food from plants and animals until they learned to domesticate plants and animals. It was something like 12,000 years ago, which marked the first agricultural revolution. Until that time, humans have over 90% of their evolutionary history has depended on the wild food. But it didn't stop with this agricultural revolution. There are still people continuing to be dependent on wild foods. And there are at least 400 pure hunter-gatherer societies on all the continents of Asia, Australia, North America, and South America. And I've been very fortunate to have lived and worked with many of these pure hunter-gatherers on 3 continents. In South Asia alone, there are more than 80 pure hunter-gatherers societies. And not only these hunter-gatherers, but also the peasant farmers, almost all the peasant farmers in India, they have to forage for wild plants and animals, not only in the lean seasons, lean periods of productive agricultural production, but also whenever there's available in the monsoons. And so the food security is not confined to agriculture alone. I mean, that's the civilizational paradigm that, or the sign of civilization is agriculture, and therefore we can accumulate, we can store the food grains, and so unlike any of these wild food that we can store, most of them. But forests, grasslands, wetlands, all of these habitats, wild habitats, are very important sources of food for most of these forest people. And agroforestry is just a borderline case where forestry and agriculture, the beginning of agriculture, is a mixture of these. And these are periodically cleared forest patches where some agricultural crops and the continuous production of wild foods from the forest. And this wild food gathering, hunting, fishing particularly, and also hunting of all kinds of animals, that continues with all the societies, especially the forest people in South Asia. So far, all the publications, I will just not refer to what is already known and acknowledged academically and officially, internationally, by food and agriculture organizations of the United Nations and the governments of different nations, that a range of between 10% and 15%, 50% of the nutrition of all the indigenous forest dependent people come from wild foods. In southern Odisha alone, our own study with living farms, and we have published that, where Kavita Kuruganti and Devjit, significant part of this, this study, and we are authors, Salome too, all four of us were there. And so we showed that at least 98 types of wild food actually constitute 12% to 24% by weight of all the foods annually cooked and consumed in the forest households in 2 districts that we had studied. The other studies that indicate that it's not just the food, actually the quantity of food that is collected from the forest depends on the quality of the forests, and this quality of the forest also depends on the nature of the forest governance. And it of course shows that if it is in the hand of the people, the user community, it's much better than in the custody of statutory institutions. So in our new study that we continued from 2017 and 18, which we published in 2018, we covered 2 districts of South Odisha, and with 2 types of forest. One was, and two types of governance. One was the community management in the hands of the people, the community, the user community, and another is the statutory management, that is protected forest and reserve forest in the hands of the forest department. So 2 types of forest, 2 types of management and governance, and 2 ethnic compositions. One in Rayagada district was all tribal people, and in Bolangir district it was non-tribal people and caste society. And the result was that it's a very brief summary of this. We covered this, all these, the wild food that's come from the plant kingdom, fungi kingdom, and animal kingdom. And the animal kingdom includes all 2 kinds of insects, including 1 ant, fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, and of course for the plants and mushrooms, there were plenty of these. Now in this list, we have included only those which are consumed at least 5 days on 5 days of year. The items which are not consumed less than that, less frequently than 5 days a year, we have not included. If we had included it, the number would have been at least double these numbers. So there are many of these now, even the flowers are eaten, the mahua flowers, Bauhinia papuira, there are wild tubers, diascoric tubers, and wild mushrooms, 17 species that we have documented, wild fruits, leaves, flowers, and also the ants' eggs. These are the Ecophilus maragrina, which is leaf stitching ants, red ants, and the ants and legs. It's I can assure you, including the non-people, that it's delicious. We are good, very good pickle kind of thing. Then we actually made this analysis of to identify the drivers of this food quantity, not only the species, but also the quantity of these, each of these food items that is harvested from this forest. And one significant driver, I'm not going into the detail of the statistical proof of all of these, but essentially you can visually see this, the relationships. The blue column is one forest which is in the hands of the community, and the red column is in the hands of the state forest, state statutory department. And in every case, we show that number of tree species, ENS is the effective number of species, which is an ecological measure of diversity, and maximum number of food species available from that particular forest, and food biomass. As it's obvious that when we have in all these cases, all the ecological status, number of species, and number of food species available, and food biomass that is actually harvested from the forest are always much higher in the community held forest, community managed forest, than from the forest which is managed by the statutory institutions. The same thing is more prominent in the 2 districts in 4 types of forest. In the case of Bolangir, CFM and the state SF stands for the state forest. In Bolangir, in both these cases, we have this the tree species are higher in the community forest than in the state forest in both the districts, in Rayagada and Bolangir. And obviously, as a result of this, the edible species number and the actual biomass that's harvested by the communities are correspondingly higher than in the state forest management regime. And we can see that the actual biomass, the quantity of this forest and the edible species in Bolangir is proportionately a bit higher than in the Rayagada district. But in some cases, it's much less because there are some cultural constraints that some species are not eaten by the caste communities, but it's regularly eaten by the tribal communities. So it could be some certain kinds of mushrooms, for example, certain animals, certain other plant like tubers may be avoided by certain caste communities because of their specific restraint in the cultural, in that particular local food culture. But that restraint may not be, is not there in some of the tribal communities. So this also reflects that the food culture also determines the quantity of harvest of each of these quantities. So the summary of this study is that there are 3 we can summarize. One is that the species richness in the forest and the ecological status of the forest in custody of the user community is much better than in the custody of statutory institutions, same type of forest. The second is that the food availability is significantly greater in the community managed forests than in the reserve forests. Not only the protected forest, but also in the reserve forest as it happened with the Bolangir forests. And the third is that the quantity of the harvest of the food diversity also depends on the local food cultures. So these are the 3 scenarios that we have statistically shown, and the sample size was enormous. For each forest, we actually counted something like 20,000 hectare per forest, and based on that, it's a line transects of 20,000 hectare of this, and we are confident that this could be by and large the same kind of thing for all the other community managed forests all over India. Of course, the species number and the identities of the species and the quantity of harvest will fluctuate according to this community and their food cultures. But by and large, this is the general pattern that we have indicated. And now we are talking about, we have already talked about the food security, and all this quantity is now round the year about this availability. But the nutritional value of this forest, we also made this analysis for the first time of all these wild foods available and harvested from the forest. This is all these different kinds of, this is a summary, kinds of diascoric tubers. We also identified many of this beta carotene, and Salome has also mentioned about this, the high availability of beta carotene in many of these wild plants. And that actually is enough to argue against this, the unnecessary investment for millions of dollars in developing some transgenic crop, one particular type of crop to address this kind of vitamin or any other nutrient deficit, availability deficit, which are all freely available from all of these. Similarly, we have this different kinds of mushrooms. They're also very rich, 6.71 mg per gram. It's not mg per 100 gram, it's mg per gram. It's such hugely available beta carotene, and antioxidants. That's another very important, and you can see this, the last one, the kale chatlu has 63 mg per ml of the antioxidant activity, which is enormous, and in most cases it's much higher than many of the cultivated crops. Then there are many kinds of leafy vegetables, similar scenarios. We have different kinds of, yes, and Gandhari shag is one. This Olax candens is another one which is very typically consumed and harvested by the local communities in Odisha, southern Odisha, which is not so much popular and not so much available in North India. But this has enormous antioxidant activity and 78 μg, which is 20 times higher than the golden rice availability of beta carotene. And these are the scenarios that we have actually estimated from our own lab and also IICD in Kolkata. Similarly, there are many fruits and all these kinds of, apart from this, protein and starch and carbohydrate, all these antioxidant activity, beta carotene. And then we also have studied B vitamins, vitamin B1, B2, B3.
Time up.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry to interrupt you, but a minute more.
Yes, we know. And we can see this beta B3 has enormous content of vitamin B3, which is very rare in many of these cultivated crops, but we have these so many of these leaves and fruits. And then you have iron content, very significantly nutritional, significant iron, zinc, copper. You can find this enormously high quantity of iron in mushroom and Cephadeza leaf and Dioscoriid tuber and many others. This is just a summary of this. We can have this zinc and iron and deficiency. And now genetic engineers are talking about iron deficiency and zinc deficiency to redress by genetically modified crops. We already have the answers for free from nature. So to invest so much of this enormous quantity of public money to developing some genetically engineered crop plant as a potential solution to a nutrition deficient among the rural poor, while there is already a plethora of zero-cost nutritious foods from the wild, is economically worthless and scientifically nonsensical. I'm sorry to use these very strong words, but it's practical, it has to be told. And a food policy that fosters and enhances forest biodiversity to meet the local needs of food is more intelligent and reasonable than a policy that promotes monoculture in both forestry and agriculture. So monoculture in agriculture is already in place with the green revolution style and the doubly green and the deeper green revolution style. And the forestry is also focusing on monoculture. So we have to focus on this, overturn this, and we have to overhaul this, the policy in both the cases. So that's the summary, and I end this. And for further information, we have already published in our publication here. So you can, interested people can procure this one from the living farms for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debal. Exciting and scintillating as always. And I'm very glad that you have highlighted quite a lot the governance implications of all of this, who should be taking decisions and who should be controlling the ecosystems and the lands in which uncultivated foods exist. Before we get to Devjit, can you stop sharing the screen? Before we get to Devjit, I'm going to request Ishtiaq to please give a quick translation of the first two speakers' presentations.
या शुक्रिया आशीष भाई। बहुत जल्दी में हम दोनों पूर्वताओं की बात को समेटने की कोशिश करेंगे। सलोम यशुदास ने बहुत स्पष्ट रूप से कहा कि हमारी भोजन की थाली जो है वो बहुत लगातार छोटी होती जा रही है। उसमें जो भोजन की अलग अलग की विविधता घट रही है और उन्होंने अनकल्टिवेटेड फूड की जो परिभाषा दी वो ये दी कि ऐसे भोजन जो मनुष्यों द्वारा उगाए नहीं जाते बल्कि कुदरती ढंग से खुद ही तैयार होते हैं। तो उसमें वो आमतौर पे जिसको हम खर पतवार या घास मान करके चलते हैं तो उसमें बहुत सारे भोजन हमारे छुपे होते हैं। ये जंगल से भी हमको मिलते हैं इस तरह के भोजन, जिसको हम जंगली भोजन भी कह सकते हैं। फिर खेतों से मिल सकते हैं और पानी भी इसका एक बहुत बड़ा स्रोत है जहाँ से बहुत तरह का अनकल्टिवेटेड फूड हम लोगों को मिलता है। फायदे के रूप में वो बता रही थी कि इनमें रासायनिक तत्वों की मात्रा बहुत कम होती है या न के बराबर होती है। और उन्होंने एक अनुभव एक किसान का बड़ा अच्छा बताया, वो था कि हर जगह कहीं भी भोजन के लिए जाते हैं तो पहचान पत्र की मांग होती है, लेकिन खेत हो या नदी हो या जंगल हो वहां से भोजन लेकर के आने में हमें कभी किसी पहचान पत्र की जरूरत नहीं होती है और वो हमसे पहचान पत्र नहीं मांगते हैं। तीसरी अच्छी बात ये उन्होंने बताई कि विविधता इसमें बहुत है, फूड डाइवर्सिटी बहुत ज्यादा है, पोषक तत्वों से भरपूर है फॉरेस्ट फूड, इसमें मिलावट की गुंजाइश बहुत कम है और ये स्थानीय और पारंपरिक ज्ञान से जुड़े हुए हैं ये तमाम तरह के भोजन, और मौसमी बदलाव जो हैं उनसे कम प्रभावित होते हैं, और ये ज्यादा मजबूत हैं अपने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में भी। और उन्होंने जो अपनी बातें कही वो पूरी तरह से नेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ न्यूट्रिशन हैदराबाद में जो अध्ययन हुए हैं उनके आधार पे कही। और उन्होंने ये भी बताया कि खेतों में बरसात और सर्दियों में ज्यादा मात्रा में हमको इस तरह के अनकल्टिवेटेड फूड उपलब्ध होते हैं, जबकि जंगलों में गर्मी के मौसम में इनकी उपलब्धता ज्यादा होती है। फूल हो, फल, पत्ते, बीज, जड़ सभी उपयोगी हैं। इनमें एक महत्वपूर्ण बात उन्होंने बताई। फिर इससे हमको भोजन भी मिलता है, पशुओं के लिए चारा भी मिलता है, फाइबर भी कई तरह के मिलते हैं, और दवा भी मिलती है। खेतों में इस्तेमाल करने के लिए मल्चिंग इससे मिलता है, और साथ साथ हमको इनसे ईंधन भी प्राप्त होता है स्रोतों से। फिर उन्होंने एक बात जो बहुत अहम बताई वो ये बताई कि अनकल्टिवेटेड फूड जो है उसमें उगाए हुए भोजन या कल्टीवेटेड फूड के मुकाबले में पौष्टिकता ज्यादा होती है। फ्रूट डाइवर्सिटी के बारे में उन्होंने बताया कि हम आमतौर पे बहुत थोड़े से फलों के बारे में जानते हैं, हमारे बच्चे तो और भी कम जानते हैं, लेकिन जंगलों से मिलने वाले जो फल हैं उनको बहुत तरह के हैं। फिर उन्होंने पौष्टिकता के मामले में एक बात जो जोड़ी वो थी फाइबर की। रेशेदार भोजन के बारे में उन्होंने कहा कि ये पाचन के लिए, हमारे पाचन तंत्र के लिए बहुत अच्छे हैं, पौष्टिकता इनमें ज्यादा अच्छी होती है, और दांतों के लिए भी बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। फिर उनका ये कहना था कि अगर हमको ये फॉरेस्ट फूड्स को बचाना है या अनकल्टिवेटेड फूड को प्रमोट करना है, तो उसके लिए जरूरी है कि जंगलों का जो दूसरे कामों में इस्तेमाल हो रहा है या उनका जो डाइवर्जन हो रहा है दूसरे प्रोजेक्ट्स के लिए, उसको कम किया जाए। जंगली भोजन में जो पौष्टिकता है उसकी विविध जांच हो और उसको लोगों तक पहुंचाया जाए, और पंचायत स्तर पे जो वहाँ के डाइटरी डाइवर्सिटी है और जो वहाँ उपलब्ध होने वाले इस तरह के भोजन है उनकी पहचान। देवलदा के की प्रस्तुति के बारे में हम बहुत संक्षेप में बताना चाहेंगे कि उन्होंने कहा कि मानव इतिहास का लगभग 90% हिस्सा जो है इंसान जंगली भोजनों पे ही निर्भर रहा है, और जंगलों पे आधारित लोगों के 10 से 50% तक भोजन जंगली भोजन से आता है। दक्षिणी ओडिशा में उन्होंने बताया कि जंगलों से कम 98 तरह के 98 किस्म के भोजन मिलते हैं। उन्होंने एक बहुत शानदार अध्ययन आधारित अनुभव बताया। वो ये था कि सामुदायिक वन प्रबंधन जो जिसको हम कम्युनिटी फॉरेस्ट मैनेजमेंट कहते हैं, उसमें और स्टेट फॉरेस्ट में हर तरह से विविधता ज्यादा है। वहाँ पे पेड़ों की भी विविधता ज्यादा है, वहाँ से मिलने वाले भोजन की भी विविधता ज्यादा है, और बायोमास भी हमको ज्यादा उपलब्ध होता है। फिर उन्होंने एक और महत्वपूर्ण बात ये बताई कि स्थानीय भोजन संस्कृति का पर हमारा जंगली भोजन की विविधता पूरी तरह से निर्भर है। फिर उन्होंने एक बहुत सारे पेड़ पौधों में या जंगली भोजन में मिलने वाले अलग अलग पौष्टिक तत्वों की व्याख्या की है, उसमें हम नहीं जाएंगे। सिर्फ एक गंधरी साग के बारे में वो बता रहे थे, जिसमें उन्होंने कहा कि ये जो जेनेटिकली मॉडिफाइड गोल्डन राइस डेवलप किया गया है उसके मुकाबले में 12 गुना ज्यादा बीटा कैरोटीन उपलब्ध होता है। तो इसलिए उनका ये कहना था कि हम लोगों को इस तरह के जो गैर जरूरी प्रयोग चल रहे हैं उन पे ध्यान न दे करके जो जंगली फूड है उस पे, उनके विकास पे और उनके विस्तार पे ज्यादा ध्यान देना चाहिए। और उन्होंने आखिरी बात जो हमने नोट की है वो ये नोट की है कि मोनोकल्चर की पॉलिसी हमारी यानी भोजन उत्पादन में हमने एक मोनोकल्चर की पॉलिसी अपना रखी है, उसके जगह पे भोजन विविधता की पॉलिसी को हमको क्रॉप डाइवर्सिटी की पॉलिसी को अडॉप्ट करना चाहिए। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
शुक्रिया इश्तियाक, बहुत बहुत। और आपको हम फिर से बुलाएंगे जब देवजीत का हो जाए। देवजीत, ओवर टू यू।
Is it audible? Is it visible? Hello?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. Thank you. My sharing is based on my experience of being with, living and working with this community for the last 20-25 years. This is a community, they are known as Cones in southern Orissa. So when we have been talking about forest foods, uncultivated foods, my sharing will be mostly on forest foods. So foods available in the forest for this community. What I would like to share with you that for this community, forest is so integral to their being and becoming. I mean, your elders in the village will share you that we do interact with the forest on a regular basis. They believe that their ancestors are in the forest. One day they will go to their forest and their children will also go to the forest. So in a way, it's a past, present and future. So they live with the forest. It's a continuum. And so they say that forest is our child and we belong to the forest. It's that a relationship. So when we talk about that language, that we belong to the forest and forest belongs to us, and so we interact with the forest, many a times this language is difficult to understand by many actors, including NGOs, forest personnel, traditional forest scientists. So the food which is get collected in the forest is part of the local food system of the community. There have been a few questions by people who are participating in today's webinar and earlier as well, that are there dangers in over harvesting, whether tribals are felling forest, are they not over harvesting? Yes and no. I mean, if you go and interact with elders, there are very clear unwritten code of ethics of what you can do, what you cannot do. Like this slide is self-explanatory, so I'm not going to read out. There are both do's and don'ts, so you cannot fell certain trees. So when the child starts walking, the child accompanies his or her parents, and the child continues to observe, and when the child becomes young and then adult, so this learning moves beyond cerebral to internalization. So when the child becomes adult, this learning becomes part of her or his life, that we will not do A, B, C, D, and we will do A, B, C, D. So there is a code of unwritten code of ethics in the community to take care of the forest. And so what is to be harvested, how it is to be harvested, is a lifelong learning and sharing. So we cannot distinguish food from the forest because it's very much within there. And they do have, like one I have explained here, that when they say that if you enter into the forest, and so the women, I remember a few weeks ago, few people went to the forest, went with a mobile. So the woman said, please put off the mobile, because if you are in the forest and if your phone rings up and if you start answering in Oriya is the language spoken in the state, then you will be stung by the honeybees. Now that's a belief. Is this true, false? I do not know. But that's the belief that everybody and anybody cannot get into that forest, otherwise you will be attacked. And these are the some belief systems they do have to conserve their forest, and they to respect the relationship with the forest. Similarly, we have observed how do they harvest their canvas, their tubers, how do they harvest the bamboo shoots. Now they are harvesting bamboo shoots. The way they apply the pickaxe so that the root of the bamboo is not harmed, and yet the bamboo shoot is harvested, that's a training when a child gets, when the child accompanies the parent. So this learning which happens and this training which happens, it's a lifelong. So when this child is taken away from this kind of an vyavastha, this kind of an ecosystem, and put into a residential school where the child is made to feel ashamed of who she is or he is, then this learning is get disconnected, and for them, for him or her, then the forest becomes a resource and the food becomes one more product. Again, I'm not going to read out, but these explain the way people look at the forest and the relationship. In the last 6 months, 5 months, 6 months, during the Corona COVID lockdown, we haven't come across any village which we have been interacting with, around 1,200 villages. Not a single village had acute food scarcity. Why? Because they had, and weekly village hearts are closed. They are not coming to block headquarters for the fear of getting infected. But just because of forest, A, B, very, very important learning for my own life I have learned is they do harvest whatever is needed. So there's no concept of let me harvest also for day after tomorrow. Now that I guess kids learn from their parents, and that's how they grow up. Is the situation changing? Yes, the situation is changing. Especially the kids who are going to residential schools, either in the district headquarters or there is a factory school in Bhubaneswar called, there's a big factory school. They are being trained from an industrial societal perspective. Those kids are undergoing a change, and there's a tremendous amount of angst within the society. But the kids who are day scholars and those who have not been to modern school, they have not been schooled from an industrial societal perspective. For them still, this is the value that I will harvest only as much as I need. And so during the Corona, they are linking that this crisis is actually nature's tears. Nature is telling that says enough, that I'm being extracted. That is how the women explained beautifully, that this Corona crisis is a tears of nature, and we should listen to what she is trying to say. So this worldview, this nature of relationship with forest makes forest food as a part of their life. And again, the same thing which I had explained is in the same chart. So as I said, they do feel that they are the child of the forest, and sometimes forest becomes their child. So it's again reinforcing the same thing. So I'm not going to say that. Yeah, the issues here. Now, as Debolda and Salome and Ashish ji was also telling that, first of all, the Adivasis have always been termed as backward, poor, illiterate. They need to be developed from a very particular perspective. And so whatever they do is backward. Their agriculture is backward, their forestry is backward, their architecture is backward. They are backward as a society. Now this orientation, and even the worry is that even Adivasi kids who are being schooled in factory schools, even they come back by thinking that, oh, we are a backward society. And so that's a deeper worry. Be this what Debolda says about monoculture of agriculture and industrial plantations. You come to our district and we will show you. Unfortunately, the same plantation is also being funded by under climate change. Even United Nations fund for climate change and the clean development mechanisms, thousands of hectares of monoculture plantations. the way they grow mixed crops, and these forest foods are never considered as food by the civil society, as Ashish ji was telling in his introductory speech, and government also doesn't recognize. So the legal right to food, not insisting on locally produced food, nor inclusion, is a serious concern. And policy making in silos. Let me give you a very important example. In our own district, as I was sharing you, the one way of schooling the child is to accompany your parents and go to farms, go to forests, go to shifting cultivation fields, go to pottery, go to blacksmith, and then you get educated. You also learn literacy by going to school and then come back home. The other way of education is that you go and get schooled in a factory school. Now that child will never come back and say that I do relate with the education. So if I need to conserve my forest, if I'm concerned about climate crisis, then I need to be concerned about what kind of an education I am talking about, what kind of a society I'm envisaging, and accordingly, what kind of an education I am planning about for my kids for today and tomorrow. Similarly, forest and agriculture, they don't meet each other. In agriculture, they are using herbicides, and in forestry, they are saying that we will protect forest. How can that happen? Similarly, forest agriculture policies are quite divorced from nutrition, although it depends what food we grow, how do we grow, what we consume. So forest, agriculture, nutrition, education, tribal welfare, even housing. In housing policies, in the Adivasi households, there is a way that they fell trees. Which trees to be used for windows, which trees for doors, which trees for roofing. There are knowledge systems. When you break everything and bring about concrete house, external expert driven, then you break the knowledge system. And then it has a connection with the forest and forest related knowledge and the health and of course the climate crisis. So how do we bring about a coherent policy, a coherent vision for a society which will be self-sufficient, society which will be resilient, society which will be self-respecting, and then possibly do a policy making exercise. And of course, local views of forest communities, nowhere in the world I have seen where they are considered as from the policy making. So these are the things which others have also said. I'm not going to repeat. And it's now, I guess, in the last few years, colleagues in the Right to Food campaign, they have started talking about uncultivated food. But we feel that women farmers, women need to be recognized as forest conservators, not from the language of forest department, but it is they who are the custodians of the forest. It is they who are the trustee of the forest. They need to be recognized, and their role in conserving the forest and the multiple role they keep the forest sustaining, that need to be recognized. Other policies that we have seen about Forest Rights Act, even now the emphasis on individual forest rights. We have been struggling in Niyamgiri Hills on community forest rights. It has been a very difficult struggle. That will be for another occasion. And recognizing Adivasis, you cannot have forest food and forest by decimating Adivasis. You may have different multiple excuses and so we cannot de-link forest and forest food from forest people. You can't decimate people and yet talk about forest food. No, friends, it cannot happen. So we need to see this and so these are our requests. So I think we need to Salome and Devolda both were saying that we do need to talk about uncultivated foods because climate crisis has come. It is not going to come, and not bring in genetically modified forest trees or agricultural trees. These are our key principles. And we feel in the midst of different crises, we feel quite hopeful being with Cones that there is an
Devjit, your mic switched off.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah. So I said these are our statements that we feel that with Cones we see a hope, and like many other indigenous communities across the world, we see a hope where we can dream. We dream a different world where we can be self-sufficient, where we can localize our food systems, where we can reduce our dependence on the state and the market and the corporations. I think is there a slide? Last slide. So we are trying to do multiple things. We are trying to revive their village communes, which are known as kutums. We are trying to relocalize the food within 100 kilometers. Let's see. We are trying to see how young boys who are now back from the corona crisis, they are getting into agriculture and forest. We are also trying to see whether parents can teach their kids on vernacular architecture and pottery and blacksmith. So these are the few photographs I'm sharing with you. This photograph towards the left, where parents are teaching their kids on how to construct earthen houses using local materials, using local knowledge. Here is a photo of Purushottam telling stories about cones, agriculture and forest through, we run something called open learning system centers. And this is where a modern doctor and a traditional healers, they are talking about what are the plants, what are the herbs, what are the trees, what are the leaves, fruits needed to treat local ailments, thereby again connecting forest and the life system. And here a parent is teaching his child to climb the trees and have fun. So these are the basic ways of trying to see how this intergenerational learning happens in a way which becomes a way of life and not a school de-linked from way of life. Thank you.
Thanks.
देवजीत, इश्तियाक
आप जल्दी से अनुवाद कर देंगे इसका प्लीज?
बहुत शुक्रिया। तो देवजीत ने कोंड आदिवासी समुदाय के साथ उनके अनुभवों को ही अपनी प्रस्तुति का आधार बनाया। उनका कहना है कि इस समुदाय का संबंध जंगल से बहुत गहरा जुड़ा है। उनका भूत यानी जो गुजरा हुआ समय है, अभी का समय और भविष्य, सब कुछ इस जंगल से, उनके अपने जंगल से जुड़ा हुआ होता है।
माफ कीजिएगा देवजीत, कैन यू स्टॉप शेयरिंग?
या जस्ट
इश्तियाक प्लीज गो अहेड।
जी, जो अगली बात उन्होंने बताई वो ये कि उनका जंगल के साथ बहुत गहरा रिश्ता है और भोजन उस पूरे रिश्ते का एक छोटा सा पहलू है। भोजन मुख्य पहलू नहीं है उनके जीवन में जंगल से जुड़ा हुआ। फिर उन्होंने ये भी बताया कि उनके समुदाय में एक अनलिखा विधान और जिसके आधार पे उनकी पूरी मूल्य व्यवस्था बनी हुई है और जंगल के संरक्षण में इस मूल्य व्यवस्था की बड़ी गहरी और बड़ी भारी भूमिका है। कोरोना के दौरान के बारे में, कोरोना की बीमारी के बारे में एक महिला की बात वो बता रहे थे कि वो मानती हैं कि कोरोना बीमारी कुदरत के आंसू है और इस वजह से वो पूरी जो प्रकृति पे जो हमले हैं उसके एक नतीजे के तौर पे कोरोना बीमारी को देख रहे हैं वहाँ पे लोग। फिर अगली बात जो उन्होंने कही कि 200-250 गांव में उनके अपने जांच के दौरान या उनके भ्रमण के दौरान उन्होंने एक भी गांव में भोजन का संकट नहीं देखा, जबकि बड़े बाजार या हाट वगैरह सब बंद थे लॉकडाउन में, लेकिन गांव में भोजन का संकट नहीं नजर आ रहा था। फिर उन्होंने कहा कि वे उतना ही और वही हार्वेस्ट करते हैं या जंगल से निकालते हैं जितने की उनको जरूरत होती है। लेकिन साथ में उन्होंने इस बात को भी चिन्हित किया कि आधुनिक शिक्षा व्यवस्था में जो बच्चे इन जंगलों से या इन आदिवासी समुदायों के जा रहे हैं वो अपनी मूल व्यवस्था जो है, अपनी मूल व्यवस्था को भूल रहे हैं और वो आधुनिक शिक्षा व्यवस्था उनकी मूल्य व्यवस्था को कमजोर कर रही है। फिर उन्होंने अगली समस्या के बारे में ये बताया कि आदिवासी और उनकी जीवन व्यवस्था को हमेशा से पिछड़ा हुआ माना जाता रहा है और उनको मेन स्ट्रीम में या मुख्य धारा में लाने की एक हड़बड़ी, एक होड़ सभी लोगों में है, सरकार में भी है और गैर सरकारी संगठनों में भी काफी ये देखने में मिलता है। फिर अगली जो चुनौती उन्होंने बताया कि एक तरह के पेड़ों का बहुत बड़े व्यापक स्तर पे वनीकरण जिसको कहा जाता है कि एक तरह के पेड़ लगाए जा रहे हैं जंगलों के अंदर में, जो समस्या पैदा कर रहा है। फिर उन्होंने कहा कि जंगली भोजन का पर आदिवासियों का वैधानिक अधिकार होना चाहिए और इसको मान्यता मिलनी चाहिए। जंगल और आधुनिक खेती का तारतम्य नहीं बैठ रहा है अभी, क्योंकि जंगल सब कुछ संरक्षण करने के तरीके को अपनाता है और आधुनिक खेती जो है वो मारने वाली पद्धतियों पे बहुत ज्यादा निर्भर हो गई है। फिर उन्होंने कहा कि समग्र नीति निर्धारण की जरूरत है, यानी होलिस्टिक प्लानिंग की जरूरत है। उन्होंने एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण बात जो कही कि महिलाओं और वन संरक्षण में उनकी भूमिका को चिन्हित करके और प्रस्थापित करना बहुत जरूरी है। उसके बगैर शायद हम जंगल को और जंगली भोजन की जो पूरी व्यवस्था है उसको शायद हम नहीं बचा या सुधार सकते हैं। तो उन्होंने अभी जो कार्यक्रम वो चला रहे हैं उसके बारे में बहुत संक्षेप में बताया कि कुटुंब को फिर से वो पुनर्जीवित करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। जो नौजवान बाहर से वापस आए हैं लॉकडाउन के बाद, उनमें फिर से वो पुरानी मूल व्यवस्था या फिर मिट्टी के इस्तेमाल से कैसे घर बनाना है या जंगलों को कैसे फिर से संरक्षित करना है, उसकी जानकारी दी जा रही है। स्थानीय ज्ञान व्यवस्था को फिर से मजबूत किया जा रहा है। बहुत बहुत
शुक्रिया इश्तियाक, बहुत बढ़िया अनुवाद किया आपने तीनों का, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। There are lots of questions. I'm not sure that we will be able to get into every one of them, but let's see how much justice we can do. We will. I think we have also put contact details of the three speakers, or we can put them on the chat. So if anybody wants to pursue any discussions or questions subsequently, you'll have the occasion to do that. So let me start, and where I can, I will indicate who the question is to, but in some cases it might be relevant to all three. So you can decide whether one of you wants to respond or all of you. The first one is from Mayanglambam Ojit Kumar Singh, who works on edible insect ecologies. Very interesting, I presume in the Northeast. And he is saying that many of the foods that the communities were used to are no longer available because habitats have been changing because of many factors. What's your comment on that? Who'd like to take that on?
This is Debal. May I?
Please, yes.
Okay. One answer, yes. It's right that many species are not available, or the abundance has decreased significantly. And there are obviously many reasons. The primary reason is deforestation. And deforestation is not only the clear felling of the forest by the because of this statutory management, but also because of replacement of the native flora with monocultures of exotic quick growing species like eucalyptus or acacia or equioliformis to feed the paper mills. So it's essentially industrialization of forestry practices and monoculture. The second is, of course, this climate change scenario, and there's been recently over the last decade, there has been a very nice, about 20 studies by forest scientists and ecologists, which indicate that because of this, this slow increasing, global temperature, and especially the local temperatures in different kinds of forests, especially in the temperate zones, many of these forests forest species are declining by number. And not only trees, I mean, forest is not only the habitat of trees, but it's a very complex ecosystem consisting of all kinds of organisms, from animals, mammals, insects, and everything. Now, many insect species and certain populations of specific species, including the pollinators and multiple species of natural predators to different kinds of forestry pests, are also declining very seriously. And over the past decade, there's record that more than 50,000 species of insects have become endangered, and particularly 500 species have already gone extinct over the past 10 years. So this is definitely a very serious concern, and we cannot do anything about it because as the IPCC and our climate scientists have already told, that we have already crossed the threshold of going back to this, the threshold. We cannot get them back, whatever we try today. The only thing that we can do at the most is stopping further degradation, stopping further decline of this biodiversity by reducing this kind of thing, and at least overhauling the entire policy and thinking. As long as, I mean, what Debjit has already mentioned, I already said, that is it's the monoculture of the mind. This is one very serious problem. We simply refuse to think that without this kind of AC car and a job in IT sector, civilization is not possible. Until we get over this, we cannot actually recuperate our own civilization and survival. Forget about civilized way of living. And the second is the concern that I call a brain disease, is a TINA syndrome. There is no alternative. Until we get over that kind of syndrome, we simply stop looking for the alternatives. And I'm not talking about alternative which is utopian, non-existent. We have to imagine certain alternative. There are alternatives. There are alternatives in flesh and blood, in existence on all the continents. And we have been working with this. I have personally worked with many of those on 3 continents. And there are alternatives which these indigenous people, about which Debjit has also mentioned, is one such coterie of alternatives which we must recognize and bring into the mainstream. Without that, we cannot stop this.
Thanks, Deval. Maybe we'll come back very briefly at the end on this whole issue of the fundamentals of what we mean by human progress and development and so on, because that is underlying a lot of this. There's many people who have asked for materials, visual materials, books, recipe books, etc. So I'm not going to ask any of you to respond to that orally, but if you have references that you can put into the chat, please do that. Salome, in particular, I think the recipe and the book, the recipes you mentioned, the book that you mentioned towards the end, if you can put references to that or how people can get hold of that. And I should mention this on behalf of all the speakers, that none of them will be able to give you guidebooks on how to identify wild foods in your area unless you belong to the area in which they have worked. So this is very, very site specific. What works in the forested areas of Odisha that Deval and Debjit talked about will not be the same things that you will get up in the Himalaya, will not be the same things that you will get in Nagaland and so on. So this is, however, what can happen is, and maybe our 3 speakers can also tell us, is that is there some way by which there is a repository of guidebooks and materials and books and all of that that can be put up somewhere so that people can refer to them and see if there's something relevant to their own area. Soma has mentioned, and again, this is just as a comment, and Debjit also said at the end that in the last 2-3 years, the Right to Food campaign has also picked this up, and Soma mentions that the network Makam, which is the Mahila Adivasi Kisan Manch, has in fact been highlighting uncultivated foods a lot. That's not a question. She just wanted to say that, especially also because in my early comment, I'd mentioned how civil society has also largely neglected this. A question from Harsh and Atanu is about agroforestry and eucalyptus. But again, I think you people have already spoken quite a lot about monocultures, and where agroforestry, the official kind, things like eucalyptus are being promoted, that would clearly be against the interests of the diversity that is needed for uncultivated foods. So if you want to say anything further on it later, you can, but I think you've already responded to that in some way. Pranav, there's a bunch of questions which is relating to the access of wild foods to the masses of population, including urban India. Now, the concern or the question is, one, can uncultivated foods actually be the answer to food security for all of India? Two, if they are also accessed by urban populations and commercialized in some way, will that be sustainable? Urban populations can suddenly find it fanciful to eat wild foods and then like mushrooms, and then will that be sustainable? And otherwise also, how does one create an awareness about these things, especially in city people and in children, in cities because they are so far removed from forests. And I think here it may be important if you can also mention how it's not only forests, but maybe even our backyard in the city that might have edible plants. Please, any of you want to respond to this bunch of questions?
You have to.
Salome, you want to? Yes, please.
The first thing, two things I wanted to say. One is to identify the uncultivated foods from the local anywhere. It is best thing is to go with the elders who are above between 65 to 75 years old. Take them and please go make a walk, and they will identify. That is the best thing, instead of going by books or guides or anything. That is a little difficult, but not very practical. That's second. Urban India, yeah. Urban India, if they wanted to do, they can create a microclimate. Like in our backyards, if you grow some plants, or if you start a kitchen garden, automatically, because we are taking care of that soil, mother soil there, some plants will come up. We don't know which will come, because there some seeds may come up on their own. So these are uncultivated. That must be very, very clear. So on their own, they may come up if you create a good microclimate for them. Thank you.
Thanks. In the COVID times, I've actually come across an elderly lady in my colony, which is fairly highly urbanized in Pune, actually picking out plants in the cracks between the paving and the in the colony. And I asked her, and she said it's a wonderful food to eat. So there's a lot around us that we don't even recognize. Yeah. Sorry, Deval, you were adding something to this.
Yeah, I mean, these are some of these uncultivated plants which might come, but it's when you talk about the availability of those wild plants usually harvested by a forest people to the urban population is really a difficult proposition. Excepting a few items like honey, wild honey, forest collected from the Sundarban or other, Bhitarkanika forest in Odisha. These are being made available by certain things. I mean, I'm not talking of the production level and the of these, but if that can be made available, then maybe there could be a commercial venture by encouraging the forest people themselves to get this kind of thing. And the other option is the tubers, not so much of the mushrooms, because mushrooms are perishable and they cannot be transported over a long period. But tubers are definitely possible. And in many cases in Bengal, for example, wild tubers are made available in distant markets where there's the peri-urban population can get access to these kind of things. So partly this can be made available, but our contention is that it's not necessary that everyone in the city should eat all of these forest products which are appropriate for the forest dependent people in that locality. The point is that we cannot assume, as the policymakers do, that civilization and food security is confined to agriculture alone. And especially for the forest people, and particularly the people who are taking care of their own forest, the user forest. For them, this forest food and the forest habitat must be remaining accessible and available all the time, beyond any kinds of statutory restriction and legal bindings. So that's the main point, so that we don't have to later at some point we don't have to prescribe vitamin A rich golden rice as the prescription of vitamin A deficiency for those people, because it never occurred in these populations. I have never seen in any of these forest people populations all over South Asia who are deficient in in vitamin A, for example. They have perfect vision, and forget about night vision, even day vision is much more of us. So this is the point, and we have to recognize this. And the people who are really interested in tasting those, I think the best way and the only way for them is to live in a forest, maybe 7 days a month, and experience the life for themselves and taste all the delicacies and get nutrients. and get.
Thanks. And thanks. This also relates to a later question, which in a sense you already answered that, which is to introduce courses on Adivasi knowledge, or I would say local community knowledge, not just Adivasi, into universities, and having university students, and I guess also school students, go and live in these places, not as a kind of a one-day study kind of thing or helping in building a local canal or something, but actually going and understanding and appreciating and absorbing the local cultures and biodiversity and so on. Okay, so we have a question from Sudha, which says, do uncultivated foods retain their nutritional values if they are sprayed upon, either deliberately or by accident, pesticide, or if fertilizers are used in and around where they're growing? Salome, you want to respond to that?
But who's going to spray on these wild foods in the forest?
No, but there would be a lot of wild foods they will in the fields also, right? I mean, the so-called weeds and things like that.
Oh,
so
in the agricultural farms, yes.
yes,
Salome.
or for instance, pesticide going downstream in river and affecting plants downstream. So Salome, you want to respond to that?
Yes. This actually actually the uncultivated foods from the fields became less and less useful because of the pesticide spray and fertilizers use. So people are very careful that they pluck the uncultivated foods for edible purpose, especially for human consumption, before pesticide spray. Because pesticide spray begins after the main crop flowers or main crop fruiting starts. So actually within 15 to 20 days first weeding starts. 3 weedings will be done generally in dryland agriculture. So first weeding, they will take first weeds, first crop, uncultivated crops. Second weeding, another set of uncultivated crops. That's all. And if they see that it is sprayed by pesticide, they will never pick up. Yes. So actually the most hindering part for this most nutritious uncultivated food is chemical agriculture. They are poisoning the fields.
Right. And again, that relates to the whole notion of what is development, what is agricultural development, etc. So that has to be fundamentally challenged. There's a question from Bichitra Biswal about any laws protecting uncultivated foods per se. I would imagine the answer would be no, but there would be laws that are protecting or supposed to protect the habitats in which they exist. But does any of you want to respond to that? Anything to do with the legal aspects?
I've not come across any such laws specifically for uncultivated foods per se.
Yeah, so it would be more about the habitats in which they grow, which are supposed to be protected, but of course we know that they can also be subjected to violations of all kinds, especially by. Sorry.
Can I say?
Please.
Yeah, actually, the nutrition department, the entire in ICMR, Indian Council of Medical Research, is the apex body, and National Institute of Nutrition is also under that only. So, if the National Institute of Nutrition and the nutrition people in our country, if they get and if they respect them and include these uncultivated foods into their books, food composition tables, automatically the laws will come up. I think so.
There's some interesting information that's being given by various participants. I won't have the time to go into all of that, but Soma, for instance, mentions that Dr. Lena has a recipe book of about 900 recipes using uncultivated foods in Gujarat.
I know that.
Okay, so maybe one of you can put a reference to it or a connection to Dr. Lena if anybody is interested in getting hold of that. That should be the Gujarat model of development, not the one that is unfortunately being promoted. And I would also like to note the presence of a number of other people in the participants who are also in their own way experts on this subject. We have Naresh Biswas, who's done a lot of work in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh with Baigas and others. We have Satish Gogalwar and Shubhta Deshpande, who've been working a lot with Adivasis in Vidarbha in Maharashtra, and many others. We also have a lot of participants from outside India. And I wish we had another couple of hours because an interaction with all of these people would have been wonderful. But this is a beginning, and I'm sure we can carry on the conversation. Can I ask a few more questions? Sorry, Devjit, you wanted to say something?
No. I said yes. Naresh Bhai and Dr. Gongovar's work is very important, very inspiring work.
Yes, absolutely. Nice to have them all on this webinar. All right, Ashish Gosain has raised a concern, and again, that probably goes to some more fundamental issues. Is there a concern about food quality standards with regard to unprocessed foods? All the uncultivated foods would be unprocessed, so to speak. And we have this whole concern about hygiene and so on and so forth. So would one of you, maybe Salome again, you would like to go on that?
Yes, actually, uncultivated foods are very safe comparatively any other processed food. Fundamentally, basically, either it is nutrition or hygiene, whatever you say. Just wash it, eat it. Unless the local people say there is some toxin or some process has to be adapted, just like bamboo shoot, for example. They put it in a live stream and for certain days and then they will eat.
And some mushrooms and all, of course, might be. So it's very, very important, right? You said at the beginning that you go with elders who know what is safe and what is not safe. But also, I think this whole notion of certification and some government agency or somebody saying this is high quality or good, safe quality is something we have to get over and build relationships on trust, no, and on knowledge and experience rather than what is apart.
Actually, if you give me one, actually, when I took these uncultivated foods to National Institute of Nutrition, they used to comment, why are you bringing, why are you bringing all the grass to the lab and contaminating our lab?
Debel, you wanted to say something?
Question of biosafety, I mean, health and hygiene and other things. I would just now go back to this issue that the people, forest people, and have been experiencing eating all this forest food over the past 400,000 years, and they have devised many ways of identifying what is safe for health, what is unhygienic, what could be toxic, and so on and so forth. And people have, it's a complete misinformation and misconception that forest foods are consumed unprocessed. There is a series of kind of processings, excepting some of these ripe fruits and others, whether it's mushroom or tuber or different kinds of leafy vegetables. There have been many, many processes which have to be undergone before they are consumed by humans. And these processes, identification of which part is toxic and which is not, and to eliminate the toxicity of certain parts of certain mushroom or tuber, is ingrained in those local cultures of these forest people. And they're much aware about this kind of processing, which is an ingrained knowledge. So, and this knowledge has been filtered down the ages over thousands of years. So it's again a misconception that these people are so dumb that they simply they eat everything unprocessed like wild animals. So these are the understandings we have to filter out these kind of things. When you say if someone says that it's all this unprocessed, it's wrong. If it says it's unhealthy or dangerous to health, it's again wrong, because people already know it. Now, if a policymaker sitting in always living in the AC bedroom and suddenly visits a forest and munches some kind of greens, assuming that it's edible, it's up to his own risk. It's not the fault of the knowledge of the forest people about their safety.
Thank you. That's important, Debel, on the processing bit. There's a very interesting question from Simran and additional one from Pranav about, Debel, your study showing that community forest areas, community managed forest areas had a higher tree diversity and higher incidence of uncultivated foods and so on compared to state. Question is why? And also Pranav says, would some kind of government intervention not be needed in the management of natural resources for the public good? So Debel, you want to?
Yeah. The primary reason is that when it's like a really community managed forest, where the forest management, decision of keeping which tree is and eliminating some trees is is in the hands of the people. They would decide whether to increase the number of the size of the population of one particular tree, or this, the population of the insects and so on and so forth, rather than a state-managed forest, which always focuses on eucalyptus and acacia, or eucalyptus or teak, for example. So first of all is the focus on monoculture, which is the commercial industrial motive of state forestry by and large. Despite all these decades of publications by Professor Madhav Gadgil and you, Ashish, yourself too. The system, the official system and the policy has not yet changed, despite all these 2 or 3 different kinds of forest policy published altogether. But despite this, the FRA, Forest Rights Act, and all these, the importance to the community's own priority over this forest diversity and its management has not been given over. So the zamindari of the forest department continues in most of the forests, and the motivation of industrialization, industrial and commercial movement of this which is silviculture, commercial silviculture, that continues. So that's the major reason. The second reason is when we have this, the more of this number of species which were not allowed to grow, which are called minor forest species, for example. So in a shal forest or a teak forest, mahua and mango and jackfruit and many of these, the tropical trees which compose the original composition of the pristine forests are all gone or eliminated. Even when it is now protected forest or reserve forest, it's not just in the monoculture, but there the emphasis is on commercially important species like teak, shal, and mahua and others, at the expense of all the other trees and shrubs and herbs and climbers. And even there's so these, and the forest department has its its own jargons like minor forest species. Biologically, a species cannot be minor or major or superior or inferior. So they have this inferior species, minor forest produce. Now, fortunately, because of our 2 decades long experience and publications, we have been certainly able to change some of these jargons like minor forest produce. Now it is replaced with non-timber forest produce. But the concept remains that these are minor, these are inferior, and so on. So this essentially, both these reasons are lying squarely in the management practices and forest management. The third reason that they are more higher abundance is because of the cultural protection. There are many kinds of cultural norms among the forest people that even if it is not necessary, not economically important, not useful for a source of food, those species are never harvested. Those species are protected as sacred species. There are sacred patches of the forest which are maintained over thousands of years by these local communities. So these are the cultural protection in addition to the economic importance of these species, that the community managed forests retain their superior diversity and ecological status than the state managed forests. I think these are the 3 major reasons that we have detected to be responsible.
Thanks. We're actually unfortunately running out of time. There's at least another 15-20 questions. There's no way we're going to be able to respond to them. But like I said earlier, I think if we share the links of all the 3 speakers, then participants can also get in touch with them directly. And maybe the chat, a copy of the chat can be shared with the speakers, Kavita, so that if they want to respond separately, and you must be having the registration links of all the participants. So offline,
we will do that.
The conversation can carry on. So there's lots more interesting questions, but we just don't have the time. I'd like to, a quick question to Devjit, because you've not been able to respond to anything, which is on shifting cultivation. I don't know whether the Dongria Kond or the Kond actually do or maybe used to do shifting cultivation, but the issue about whether shifting cultivation in fact allows for a much higher diversity of uncultivated foods. And so when, for instance, they're asked to settle down or change to something else, that they lose that diversity. Is that true?
That's true. The answer is not yes and no. The answer is that the shifting cultivation, which is still they are having fallow cycle of 15 to at least 8 to 12 to 15 years, the diversity is very different. the shifting cultivators, farmers who themselves have realized that fallow cycle has shrunken to 3 to 5 years, they have shifted to settled agriculture, and then biodiversity is affected. So it depends on what kind of a fallow cycle I am maintaining in my shifting cycle cultivated patches. So up in the hill, in the Niyamgiri hills, where even cycle cannot go, but you have to walk 10 to, you have been, Ashish. So us gaon mein agar aap jayenge, so you will see a different situation, of course. And in the Niyamgiri hills, in the villages, foothills villages, the situation is very different in terms of biodiversity.
Great. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to take a minute at the end, any concluding remarks you have, and then I'll try and close off with some remarks. So let's go in the same order. Salome, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Reduction in chemical agriculture inputs in mainstream agriculture will increase the uncultivated foods from the farms, especially in dry lands, and that will definitely help in this COVID situation because everybody is talking about immunity. Zinc, magnesium, calcium, iron, vitamin C, whatnot, everything comes from uncultivated greens from these dryland farms. Thank you.
Thanks. Great way to end. Deval.
I would request everyone, not only the people who have participated, but also those who might hear about it later, and is that the primary importance that we must indulge, foment in our minds is that we stop thinking about forest and the forest people as uncivilized, backward, unscientific, and all of these. Rather, they are the actually torchbearer of civilization over the past 400,000 years, and that's the inheritance that we are all enjoying this fruits of civilization. Once we get this kind of this reorientation of the mind and this dichotomy of civilization against wilderness, then all the other paraphernalia and the equipment that with which to refine ourselves and improve our civilization will automatically follow. So the policy will change, our educational system will change, everything, provided our basic thinking about this dichotomization and hierarchy of civilization over wilderness is replaced with that.
Thanks, Deval. And you mentioned forests, but of course, I'm sure you also mean all other ecosystems.
Yes.
And one of the things that's not really been highlighted today is fish and fisheries. And maybe in another session, Kavita and Rohit, you can think about getting some fisher communities
Well,
also on.
Fish in the,
yeah, you mentioned, but I think it would be great to actually have a more, because that again, coastal fisheries, for instance, gets neglected also in policy circles or seen in a much more commercialized way. So I think it'll be good to have that with a maybe a session with a focus on that. Devjit, last thoughts.
We control over our food system. I said we need to reclaim the control of our food system.
Good. One single but very important concluding thought. Okay, so I'm just going to, there's no way I'm going to try and summarize this very, very rich and complex conversation. And first of all, apologies to all the participants who have asked questions and we haven't had the time to be able to respond to them. But hopefully that this interaction can continue. I just want to make a couple of quick remarks at the end. One is, I mean, we all have heard, and it's been re-emphasized again and again by the three speakers about the critical importance of uncultivated and undomesticated wild foods. And this is not just, there was one question about, are we only talking about Adivasis? No, it's actually for all kinds of communities, including urban populations in some way or the other, though we may not often recognize it. For instance, honey, as was mentioned by Deval. Secondly, the critical importance of sustaining cultures. It's not just about sustaining the economic system of agriculture or forestry, but actually the cultures that underlie or that are so closely embedded in them and through generations. There were a number of questions in the chat also about how are the new generations taking this. And it was good to hear, for instance, from Devjit and Deval, that in the Kond and the Dongria Kond, people who've come back are maybe at least showing some interest in actually coming back. We heard that from the Northeast, from Nagaland. We've been hearing this from many parts of India, that young people who've gone back to the communities because they don't have employment anymore, at least some of them are saying we may be interested in resuming agriculture or forestry or fisheries or whatever. We need to figure out systems by which in fact they can be facilitated to do that. The third thing is the value of diversity, both biological and cultural diversity. And this relates to languages, to cuisines, to the different kinds of ecological systems we live in, and so on. So this whole monoculture of the mind and monocultures of various different agricultural systems and forestry systems and all is something that has to be fundamentally challenged. Fourth, very, very important, and this also relates to a point or a question that Jyotsna had, which we couldn't get into, which is clearly this is not just about food policy. It's about land, it's about democracy, it's about who's taking decisions with regard to ecosystems and diversity and so on. It's with regard to the need for economic democracy. Unfortunately, right now we see that it's private corporations and the state that controls everything that we do in the economic realm. How do we democratize the economy itself, especially those things that are so important for us like food and water and energy and so on. And also then political democracy, which means not going to elections, but actually claiming power, like Devji said right at the end, claiming the power wherever we are to take decisions affecting our lives. Like one of the villages in central India, Mendha Lekha said, "Hamare gaon mein hum hi sarkar." We are the government in our village, not somebody else coming and dictating to us. Last point, or a couple of last points, development. Debel has kept emphasizing this. We need to question the notion of what is development, what is progress. We seem to think the progress is only going in the direction of United States and Europe and Japan, and thereby we're actually destroying ecosystems, destroying cultures. We have to try and figure out how the notion of well-being can replace development, and well-being can happen in many, many thousands of different ways around the world. Sudha had made this point in the chat that there's this notion that from wild to cultivated seems to be the way civilization should go. And then of course there's cultivated to industry, industry to services and so on. We have to destroy those notions of unilinear development to be able to protect the earth. Finally, I think all of this is based on ethics, which again, the three speakers have emphasized. The values of sharing, of caring, of living with each other, of living with and within nature, not separate from it. The values of equality, of diversity, etc. So I think those ethics come out very clearly in any discussion on uncultivated foods as they did today. So with that, thank you again, Salome, Debel, Devjit, for this really wonderful set of presentations. And thanks to all the participants for a great and still continuing set of questions. And I do hope that we can continue the conversation in some way with all those questions that participants have asked. Over to you, Kavita or Rohit, for you to end.
Thank you, Ashish. You could easily have been one of the speakers, given that you're an authority on this yourself. Thank you for agreeing to moderate the session and do it so well. To all our three speakers, Salome, Sudhas, Debel, Deb, and Devjit, and also to Ishtiaq Ahmed, who had translated into Hindi so beautifully. And all those participants, several of them who are very rich in their own experience and perspective related to the subject. Thank you for participating. Thank you for putting up with the fact that this medium has its own limitations and you couldn't speak directly to each other. Thanks for bearing with the limitations of this. I just want to announce that our next webinar is on the next Friday at 3:30 p.m. again. And it is on the 3 agriculture reform ordinances, which we hear are getting converted into bills to be introduced in the upcoming 18-day parliament session. So if you want to register for that webinar, the URL is here, tinyurl.com/3ordinances with the farmer. Please do register if you're interested in that subject. Thank you all. And thanks, Debilda, for making the effort to come out of your farm and making the technology work along with Devjit's help. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Ashish. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We'll be in touch. Hopefully, I can be there face to face with you all soon.
Yes.
Nice to see you, Ashish.